Welcome, welcome. Those of you who are just arriving, you pretty much probably know who I am, Rita McGrath from Columbia Business School. And I'm just so thrilled to be sharing the webinar space with Chris Fussell, who's with the McChrystal Group. And a couple of housekeeping things as we're all getting ourselves organized. This is being recorded, so don't say anything or type anything or show up in any way that you don't want recorded for posterity. We will make the replay available once we've had a chance to clean it up a little bit, and we'll do that afterwards. I will be taking questions through the chat, and we've got Missy on the line who will be monitoring that in case I miss something. I guess without further ado, welcome, Chris. I'm so thrilled that you're able to be here. So for those of you that don't know Chris, he's a former Navy SEAL leader and currently the president of the McChrystal Group, which was founded in part by Stan McChrystal to bring some of their insights about leadership to established organizations that could really stand to learn from it. So I thought, Chris, maybe just to get started, give us a little bit of your own background. And I, for one, don't know what it takes to become a Navy SEAL, and I would find that very interesting.
Sure. I joined the SEAL teams in the late 90s, was there for about 15 years. And I've been partners with Stan McChrystal since 2012. And we've been growing a consulting group trying to track some of our lessons over from our experiences on the battlefield. So, which has been a really interesting process. On the SEAL side, you tell me where you want to start, because that's a long road.
It's well known as an elite combat force, but there's a lot to it, as I understand it, and in particular, a very deliberate way of selecting the talent that makes it all the way through the preparation program to actually go into a combat situation. So maybe you could comment on how people make it through or don't.
It's mostly stubbornness. It's it's a funny group. I always say it's normal people with a tolerance for pain. But in reality, what you're looking for is a sense of grittiness. People that are sort of refuse to quit. It has this sort of moniker of everyone is 6'5" and bench presses 300 pounds and runs a 3-minute mile. But in reality, it's really what the selection process, the early stage selection, which is about an 8-month process. What that focuses on is finding people that know how to team together, that have a natural drive towards forming trust-based relationships with those around them. So you're not looking for, necessarily the Olympic gold medal athlete, as much as the physically good enough individual who realizes that by forming connections with teammates around them, they can accomplish a lot more than they could on their own. And so the training is designed very specifically over, decades to force that sort of behavior. You just can't get through it on your own. You have to be able to work with those around you. And many of those are folks that you've never known. And so the training itself is divided into 3 sections. And most of the attrition takes place in the first of 3 phases. And that's about a 2-month cycle. And that's where the thing like the infamous Hell Week takes place, which is, an evolution where the class starts on Sunday night and basically doesn't sleep again until Friday afternoon. So you push people hard through, physical pressure, exposure to the elements. You're cold and wet the whole time. You're obviously exhausted. And you sort of try to get people to that edge where just physically and mentally, you can no longer perform well enough. You're just beyond any human capacity. And the only way you survive through that is with your teammates. So someone's constantly struggling. And if you can shore the person up next to you, next time you're going through a hard time, they'll shore you up. And I always tell people going into the early stages of SEAL selection, I say, look, I'll give you the secret. And here it is. It's not about how fast you run or how fast you swim or how many push-ups you can do. I mean, there's a baseline, but it's not, it's not world-class requirements there. It's designed to find the person who, when they are at their worst moment, their first inclination is to look to the person to their left or right and see if they can help that person. And when you find that type of individual, you can build anything around them, right? And so the attrition rate's about 80%, 75%, so it's pretty high, but it selects through the right type of individual that you can then train them, put the equipment on them, et cetera, but most importantly, put them into small units. You know, the SEAL teams, like other special mission units, are built around 20-person teams that you break down to 4-person elements, or they can grow up to larger ones. But that's sort of the core element. And the truth inside of special operations forces broadly is you are far more than the sum of your parts. It's not a linear equation. So no matter how you don't build a franchise in a 20-person element, right? You build a collective, right? So you're not building it around one great person that everybody else falls in behind. You have to be exponentially more capable than any one individual. And that comes through, the training is important, the equipment is important, of course, but it really comes down to the personalities that want to develop deep trust-based relationships.
That is so interesting. So I want to make the transition now to Team of Teams. And I understand you have another Exhibit A, right? Great book. And I understand you have a more recent book that called One Mission.
Correct. Yep. So
yeah, okay.
Team of Teams was our first book out, which basically captured what happened in the current battlefield, information age battlefield, how we address that. And then One Mission was a quick follow-up that was essentially a playbook, a series of case studies, how businesses are implementing similar models as to what we experienced in the service.
Great. So what I wanted to go from the story about the SEAL teams, right, and these very trusting, small, proud, intense units forged out of this decades-long kind of preparation, knowing what to how to create those. And one of the observations that I took out of Team of Teams was that you go from that when people are really, really super trusting inside, right? But now I've got a special forces guy who's maybe from the Army, and he's got a different, thing. And so to go from this situation where you're very trusting and all for one and one for all within this smaller group, but to be able to cross those boundaries and create that trust with a larger community. And maybe you could talk about that transition, because I think that's so interesting.
Yeah, it was one of the core problems that we faced, and it wasn't obvious to us out of the gates, which was we had purpose-built, and maybe I'll share a little bit here to try to make it clear to those that are dialed in. The military and the special operations community, we were built like anything else, right? We had this sort of top-down structure because you need to organize yourself. And I don't blame hierarchy and bureaucracy for everything, right? They're really good systems when they're leveraged to do what they're supposed to do, right? Which is stability, scalability, efficiency, et cetera. And inside of that model, we had always, in the special operations community, hyper-focused here on these small team elements. So this is a SEAL platoon, this is an Army specialized unit, et cetera, because we were part of this thing up here was a joint community. So it included all different parts of the military. And there's an interesting history as to why the military and the Pentagon have decided to structure us like that, going back to the early 80s. But this is the model we had walking into the post 9/11 era, which is the first information age battlefield that we really encountered. And so hyper focus here. We need really specialized teams because they're the ones that go out and solve problems. And then honestly, not really a clear understanding of what this did, aside from it's the place that makes decisions and gives us resources and intelligence, essentially. And so with that mindset, we then went on to the battlefield. And what we saw was this. We saw individual problems. And so we said, well, this is exactly what we do. We're going to take individual teams and they'll go fight those individual problems. And you go here, you go here, you go here, et cetera. And what it took us too long to realize was these weren't individual problems. This was a network of problems, right? And it was growing in multiple directions far faster than we could keep up with. And it took us about a year and a half to recognize when this team goes out and interacts here, it's not just impacting this specific problem. Its energy that it's putting into the network is also impacting this problem. It's creating new opportunity to grow the network because of the information campaign that can be leveraged, et cetera. And so when this unit here that interacts would then come back and say to this enterprise level system, hey, I just learned all this new information. It's really relevant and important. By the time that this unit level leadership team here could make sense of it and get it back down to the field where it mattered, it was too late. Right? The whole problem will have changed by the time the next team was able to go out there and interact. And so what we had to do was accept the reality that there's strength in this system and there's strength in this network model, right? Which is what we were facing. And what we argue in Team of Teams and One Mission is that we eventually became a combination of the two, right? It sort of looked like this. We never drew it like that at the time, and it's always going to be imperfect, but essentially that's what we became. Let's maintain structure and stability and where we can, because that's really an important aspect of winning in today's environment. And let's also not be afraid to recognize that there's real power in a network model as well. And so that's what we eventually looked like.
So one of the principles that I find most intriguing in an organization that's just steeped in hierarchy. I mean, I can't think of a more hierarchical kind of historical set of operations than military ones. But this notion of devolving decision rights and devolving authority, I mean, that must have been quite the evolution in people's thinking, to the point where, decisions being made closest to the problem, decisions being made closest to the solution. And, when I talk to people in business about this kind of thinking, I get a couple of different reactions. One is, well, how could those people know? How could those people sort of down in the field have any idea of the bigger picture that's happening at corporate, because we're in a hierarchy, right? So all the information comes up to the top, and the top is supposed to have the global view, and how could those people possibly know? So that's one. The second resistance that I get when I'm mentioning this kind of idea is, well, what if they made a mistake? Like, isn't that super risky to put people at the front lines, with authority over these really, in your case, life and death decisions? I mean, how did that work? How did you make that happen?
Yeah. I mean, it's an important point, right? And one of the cautions that we often provide businesses is don't just decentralize and hope for the best, right? Don't flood everything out to the front edge and say you all figure it out, and do whatever you need to do to win. That'll get you a lot of action, and it'll get you successes in some pockets, but we still need that structure above it to connect it and make sense of it all. Right. Otherwise, you just have a bunch of individual people or units or parts of your business fighting their own little fight, and there's no sort of strategic coherence, right? But that's tempting as the world moves faster. You hear that a lot. We want to flatten ourselves out. We want to empower people, et cetera. And so we see that all the time in the work we do, where the leadership thinks it's saying the right thing. We're trying to empower our people and tell them to take risk and all these buzzwords that are out there. And then you go talk to the frontline folks, and they say, oh, let me guess, they tell you that they're telling us to take risk and that we're empowered. But every time we take risk that doesn't align with their intent, we get in trouble for it. Mm. And sometimes we don't know what that intent is. And so we're human like everybody else. So when we're unsure, we're just going to stop and wait for guidance. Right. And that's when they get frustrated with us, right? So it's this back and forth tension. And so what we found were two things. One, you have to find ways, well, there's multiple things, but one big area being to change your communication structure so that you're actually communicating with the right bands of folks on the appropriate cadence. In our world, we lived in a super fast-paced environment. And so Stan McChrystal, our CEO and namesake in our group, when he was in charge of those organizations, he said, we've got to communicate with as many people as possible as fast as this problem is changing. We came to recognize that was a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week problem. So every day we would start with a 60 to 90-minute video sync with thousands of people around the world that would dial in, not to be told what to do, but to share information from the front edge. They were the ones who, for the last 22 hours, they'd been out there in the battlefield, and they would come back in and say, okay, here's what we learned, here's what we tried, it didn't work, here's what we didn't know, and now we do, et cetera, et cetera. And so you'd have this conversation to resynchronize everybody and get as much clarity, what we now call shared consciousness, inside the enterprise as possible. We had 25,000, 30,000 people in this whole global organization, but every day you'd have 6,000 or 7,000 in this one conversation. So, you know, a quarter of the organization every day dialing in for an hour and a half, just to listen, share, et cetera.
How who moderated that?
We put a controller in, so you have to stick to some structured agenda, and we do the same thing when we partner with large organizations that are doing this. But you don't want it so structured that there can't be a flow, right? And so I like to equate it to jazz. I grew up playing instruments, and so, you know, people listen to jazz and think it's total chaos. Well, actually, if you understand really good jazz musicians, it's very, very structured, right? Because that's how they find the room to be creative. They know the rhythm, they stick to it, they know where they're going directionally, and then they create this opportunity for creative flow, right? And so it's the same thing in a large communication forum. If you have thousands of people that are dialed in for an hour, underneath it, you need a controller that keeps it very structured. We're going to talk about this for this long, this for this long. And then in those gaps in between, Rita and Chris can have a free-flowing conversation, but that controller needs to pull us back into the baseline. Otherwise, people dial in and say, that's just chaos. It's just people talking over each other, and I don't understand it. So it was incredibly valuable to us. So that's one big area around communication, getting people the right information, not just from top down, but across, and mostly from those people that are at the front edge. And then the other big area that was critical for us, and we've seen it work well in industry, is being very thoughtful about how you're cascading those decision rights down by level. So we weren't told on the front line, well, we're going to communicate a lot so you can do whatever you want. We were told we're going to communicate a lot and you are going to earn decision-making authorities. And you may be good enough to earn ones that normally would have sat at the 2 or 3 star general level. Or if you're not that good, you're not going to get that many authorities, right? And so teams that are highly effective and prove their competency will be able to move with real independence, and they'll be able to get a lot done. Teams that aren't that capable yet, maybe they're new, maybe the leadership isn't good, maybe they don't have as much experience, we're going to put more of a governor on them. They're going to have to call and ask permission for more things. And every time they prove they're competent at something, they'll gain that authority, right? So it's not chaos for the sake of chaos. It's structure so that you can move very quickly. There's a saying in the military, slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? So it's that slow down so that you smooth things out, and then you can move really quickly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true. One of the models that I use a lot when working with corporates is there's a very interesting framework for how many projects you can work on before you have an absolute collapse in value-added time. And it turns out the right number is 2. And once you load on more than 2 or 3 projects at a time, your value-added time at work begins to collapse. And one of the lessons is indeed that, which is you've got to set priorities, because if you don't do that, you end up, just task switching all the time, and it's exhausting. It's I think one of the things that's happening with COVID-19 is people are just task switching much more than they used to have to do, and I think that's been a big challenge. So one of the questions that's coming in is about specific behaviors. Were you really clear about kind of what behaviors are okay and which behaviors are not?
Yeah, I mean that's a lot of ways you could look at that. For sure, in the military, if it's specific to that, there were laws and codes of conduct, et cetera, that were immovable, right? No system was going to try to undermine sort of the governing rules of how we go into conflict. So that was always there as an immovable, overarching set of law and order, so to speak. Then under that, the real sort of behavioral change came. There's the column of we're changing rules, who can make what decisions, how long this asset can be in this part of the fight, and who has the authority to shift those, big moving parts around the battlefield, but those are things you can write down. And then there was the rules of personal interaction. That's probably where the biggest shift was. And when we work with corporate clients, where we really have to focus in the most, because I'll tell any corporate client out of the gates, we can rewire the way you communicate and sort of process map your decision-making authorities relatively quickly. And with technology, and especially the last 3 months, people have been forced to learn remote connectivity, obviously. So that's at our fingertips. You can do that pretty quickly, even for, Fortune 50 company, at least in theory. The hard part is when you're now in that environment, are you as the senior executive, are you using the right language to make that productive? Or are you going to revert to your old behaviors and think, well, now I have 300 people or 3,000 people on this Monday morning call, and I'm going to use it as a giant megaphone. At which point it's just bureaucracy on scale. And then people are they'll dial in because they have to, but they're really not going to see it as something they can leverage effectively. Or are you learning to step into that environment, which we watched our leaders do themselves, and change the rules of behavior? And when you give your update, instead of me as the senior executive saying, thanks for that, moving on to the next, I say, Rita, that's really interesting. Tell me why you think that happened. What has changed about our relationship with that client? You're closest to it. I would have thought they would have said X. They said Y. What's your thinking? I don't know what you're going to say. You might say, well, they don't really like our new strategy, and so they're backing away. And that might offend me, right? But I have to be ready for that as the executive. And I have to be ready to have that conversation in front of hundreds. And when one person sees a performer like yourself do that, they say, you know what? I should tell them about this other problem I'm seeing, because it's getting bigger, right? And now Chris has demonstrated his willingness to listen to real problems. But that's, that doesn't happen overnight. That's something you really have to think deeply about to ingrain it into the culture.
Well, it's so interesting that a couple of people I've had in the Fireside series. So one is Amy Edmondson, who's very famous for the concept of psychological safety in teams. And, we know that the teams in which people feel that they're not able to speak up are often teams that are at great risk, because the perspectives that you need from out at the edge is missing. And then the other guest I've had is Linda Hill, who talks about collective genius, which I think is very similar to your notion of shared consciousness, that the job of the leader is to knit together slices of genius so that as the collective, we have a collective sense of genius. And I found in the book one of the really interesting stories, let me see if I can dig it up, was about one of your LNOs, and Lieutenant Commander Conway, and the story was there. And this guy was not part of the unit to which he was delegated. So as I understand the context, it was you send somebody sort of from headquarters out to the field, and they're, hi, we're from corporate, we're here to help you, right? Everybody loves that. And so he got the cold shoulder turned to him, and so he spent like a couple of months taking out the trash and ordering lunch for people, But then eventually there was a breakthrough, and I thought that was just a really interesting story about sometimes what you have to do is really make that human connection before the resources can be taken advantage of by the people that you're trying to help. Yeah,
it's that liaison model we came to call LNOs in the military. It's not new. I mean, that those have existed in the military for thousands of years. But traditionally, what it was, if you think of a more static sort of military environment, a big unit moving this way, a big unit moving this way, and you don't want them to bump into each other because that would be really bad, right? So you exchange liaisons, and they sort of keep track of, here's what my team is doing, here's what your team is doing. And it was a pretty simple job. And so historically, you'd sort of send the knucklehead over to do it, right? Because you want to keep your best people, and this is a pretty simple job, so let's send that person. And what McChrystal realized was this is a relationship game, right? And that sort of stuff, we're not going to bump into each other. Like, technology's made that not a problem anymore. But I still need to develop trust between these big organizations. And so in that example, this is one of our super high performers getting sent to a civilian organization on the other side of the world that was in the middle of one of a real growing hotspot. And so, someone that's very, very high performer in a battlefield environment saying, okay, now put on a civilian uniform and go in bed with these people. And here's your mission: develop relationships, get a sense of trust developed between our organization. You represent all of us. Share information that's helpful to them. Be their partner. Don't be there to spy on them and give us information. If we need something from them, we'll just ask. You're there to bring them as much insight from us as possible, so that we can eventually break that wall down and they start to see us as real partners here. And so that methodology was scaled all around the world, which is how McChrystal was able to expand this team of teams concept well outside of the boundaries that he controlled and into a global set of networked relationships.
So along the way to that outcome, which I just think is an amazing story, can you talk about some of the things that didn't go the way you hoped they would and kind of what you learned from that? I mean, not betraying any confidences or anything, but I'm sure you didn't hit on this solution, fully formed in your head day one.
No. And the biggest problem was the end state was just unknown and unknowable, frankly. So which
is kind of where we all are now, right? I mean,
for sure. Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen next week, let alone, 6 months from now.
No, exactly right. And so the biggest challenge was, and now that we have a theory of the case about what right looks like, you can move much faster, order of magnitude faster. But it took our senior leadership, well over a year to identify that the problem was fundamentally an organizational structure issue, that sort of traditional model versus networks, and to start to think, okay, does this fundamentally change the rules of the game? And the analogy started to become funny. Like, this isn't like checkers versus chess. This is checkers versus rugby. It's just completely different game. And so we have to change like all of our thinking if we're going to be able to survive in this environment. And so that led to constant missteps, right? And so when you write books, you can paint the nice picture. We did this, then this, then this, and this. But the reality is, for everything you do right, there's 10 things that didn't work. What our leaders knew out of the gates, though, was networks communicate faster. Not because they're brilliant, just because that's the only lever point they have. They just share information constantly. They try to recruit people into their movement. It's true in the terrorism world. It's true in social movement theory. It has good effects. It has bad effects, but that's just a network reality. So we need to communicate faster and with more people. That was the one constant that never changed. The missteps along the way, probably the one that I see most frequently in industry, that we really try to warn against was the whole concept of flat is fast. And so that was one of the first things we did. We've got to take this, because that was kind of the buzzword going back even 15, 20 years ago. We got to flatten our organization, right? Because this top down, bottom up is too slow. And we came to realize this is what flat looks like. This is you as the executive, and this is everybody talking to you about every single decision, right? And that, to your point, you can maybe do two things at a time if you're good. This is you getting no sleep on a Saturday. This is you, texting people at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, because that's what you've said. Let's be flat, which means any question, I go straight to Rita because she's the boss. And the knock on we hear from executives is, I'm getting on a plane to fly from Chicago to London, and I'm getting a text about a tactical issue, and can I make a decision? I'm thinking, why? If I'd have gotten on this plane, it would have been 6 hours before somebody made that very basic decision. What am I doing wrong that people don't? And we'll say, well, are you overplaying that we're a flat organization? Because in one way, that's saying, I don't trust you to make decisions. We went through that. We over task saturated our headquarters because we over leveraged our direct access to them. And then the response was, okay, let's cascade decision-making authorities in a very logical function. And you should think twice before you reach up and ask for permission. And if it's a decision you're expected to make it. Because otherwise, we're just going to overload the center.
Exactly. So one of the things Patty McCord, who was a previous guest here as well, talks about a lot. She's the founding HR leader at Netflix. and ton of work on like what kind of culture do you need in a high performance place. And one of the things she talks about a lot is if you provide people with the context. So what's the strategy? What are the objectives? What are our major assumptions? How are we being measured? What's the outcome we're trying to drive? If you're super clear on that you don't need to spend a lot of time controlling them. Like they'll know what to do. And it sounds to me as though what you're doing is something very, very similar in the world that you're exploring.
Yeah, no, I'm a huge fan of the work that structural work that Netflix has done to that point. Sort of pod approach, that very program and project oriented, very decentralized authorities. So they're setting a great example, and it was certainly similar in the sense of when we recommunicated every day. So we're resynchronizing ourselves, and I'm not a big sports person, but it's an obvious analogy to like football of the huddle and the play, the huddle and the play. So but you're increasing that rhythm from a quarterly to a cycle what I tell people in industry all the time is you don't have to do something like that every day. You need to do it a little bit faster than the problems you're trying to solve for. Mm-hmm. If that's 24/7, then that's your reality. But most organizations we work with, it's 7 to 14 days is somewhere the right cadence for that type of the rhythm of the organization. Mm-hmm. But when you're resetting, and I think probably similar to what Patty mentioned about Netflix, what our leaders were talking to about us every day was not, okay, Rita said this, therefore Chris, go do this. We would solve that ourselves because I'm there listening to you. Mm-hmm. And I would be pinging your staff point to point saying, okay, if she thinks this, then I'm going to go do this. And we don't need to ask anybody. So they knew that was a waste of their time. What they were doing was constantly pulling those new insights up to how they saw us as a culture. And they were looking for opportunities to say, hey, everyone, understand, Rita just solved this problem that I didn't even know existed. And she solved it because Chris and Andy knew her problem well enough to share in real time what they were seeing on their side of the fight. Mm-hmm. No one else got involved. Like that's who we need to be as a culture. Mm-hmm. So it was always that lifting up to who are we as an organization? Underneath that umbrella, take as much action as your decision space allows you, and we will. The knock-on effect will be that we win. The previous North Star was win at all cost or something. Yeah. The North Star shifted to here's who we are as a culture, and if we maintain that, we will win as an outcome.
That's fascinating. So before we leave the military for a minute, because I do want to ask about your sort of what you're doing and how you work with companies, which I think is super interesting. One of the big contrasts that's often made by outside observers is between sort of the principles of guerrilla warfare and the principles of more hierarchical established warfare. And it sounds almost like what you've done is created this hybrid between the two, where you've got the speed and the sort of ear to the groundness of the classic guerrilla tactics with the responsiveness, with the scale of a large organization. And one of the interesting things about guerrilla warfare, and I'm thinking here of the conflicts in places like Vietnam, China, certainly Mao Zedong sort of wrote the book on it, the collective, selected works of Mao Zedong. And what they basically do is they use their opponent's resources against them. That eventually the opponent gets so exhausted, and we've had a couple of questions about how do you avoid getting exhausted, that they just give up. And, I will never forget as a young person watching, the Americans leave Vietnam and people all over the world were saying, how on earth did this happen? How on earth could that happen? And I think that's because you're almost using the scale and scope against your opponent.
No, it's, yeah. And there's parallels in what we experience, what's happening in industry. And that's one of the fundamental misunderstandings. And you can look at great mistakes made by large, powerful nations, ours included, in both hot and cold conflict, right? When you misunderstand the rules of the game, right? Yeah. If you are playing an adversary with a deep-rooted ideology that will last through generations, it doesn't matter how strong they are relative to you. That's not the game they're playing. They're on this And for those that haven't picked it up yet, Simon Sinek's most recent book, The Infinite Game, is all about this. Like, what is the difference between a near-term, quarterly, annual cycle, or even our own U.S. government election cycles, et cetera, that puts you on this arbitrary set of boundaries and rules because I want to get reelected, I want to get my budget passed, I want to win X amount of space before I redeploy home, et cetera. Mm-hmm. If that's your game and your adversary is playing an infinite game where they're going to be here for 10 years, 100 years, 500 years, you have to change your mindset because they don't have to be stronger. They can never win a single interaction and still beat you because you will tire and your system will pull you out of there. I mean, that's arguably what happened to us in Vietnam, and you've seen it in other interactions. So it's much more of a mindset shift to understanding what game you're playing that is so critical.
That's such a great observation. And you know, it's interesting if you look at some of the conflicts going back to the Revolutionary War, right? And essentially the British were fighting this hierarchy-based, you know, you all line up in a straight line and shoot your muskets all at once. And the Americans in that case were the guerrillas. So
right. We've been the insurgents throughout our lives.
So your tour of duty military kind of begins to wrap itself up. You decide to recommission yourself into civilian duty. What were some of the surprises? What were the things that were the same, and what were some of the things that were really different that you found?
Yeah, I think I was most pleasantly surprised by the quality and level of leaders that I found on the outside. And I have plenty of obviously close friends that are still in the service. And I tell them that all the time. Like you're going to be pleasantly surprised with when you think of the positive attributes of the leaders we looked up to the most in the military. There are leaders like that throughout industry. And by that, I mean, there are people who graduated school, went into industry, and have from day one been very focused on creating teams, understanding and communicating the mission, mentoring and grooming others, trying to understand, you know, who they are there in service of, both the people in their organization and their end user, whether that's the U.S. population and the civilian leadership the military works for, or your consumer on the end of whatever your business is. So a lot of those similarities in personality I've been pleasantly surprised by. And I would have never said this when I was uniformed, but I am now a huge advocate. It will never happen, I don't think, in our system, but of the idea of senior industry folks laterally transferring into the military at a high rank. I've worked with men and women in the corporate space where I think, wow, she would be a brilliant colonel. Bring her in as a logistician. She's a brilliant supply chain officer. Bring her in as a logistician and let her spend 2 years there. It would take her 2 months to understand the different language, et cetera. She would excel at that job, and then let her come back out. And now she has this deep tie to understanding the military. So I would have never guessed that was a reality, but that's been an amazing, pleasant surprise. The negative, I think for me, has been the disconnect and separation between the two. You know, I've had the unique opportunity now to sort of live two lives, 15 years in the service, almost a decade on the other side. And there's just a fundamental separation between those two parts of our country. And in many ways, you could argue the foundation of our constitutional republic is grounded in an understanding between those two, right? The service into the country and the country understanding what those that are serving on their behalf are trying to accomplish. And through, I think, legal shift and process rather than evil actors, there's just been a steady separation between those two. There's been a decent amount written on it in the last 10 years, but I think it's one of the fundamental risks in how our country sees itself right now. We tend to see the military as this other thing, this different class of people, whether that's good or bad, as a disconnected. I've been surprised at the language you hear around well, the military thinks this. And when I hear that, I always say the military doesn't think anything. Well, it does, but the military is there to execute what its civilian leadership that you've elected tell it to do. And it will execute that to the best. It doesn't have an opinion collectively. Individually, sure, but one of the first things you do when you join the military is you put your personal opinion to the side and you dedicate to the service of the nation. So that's a scary separation. And then on the military side, you can see it in reverse. Well, lazy civilians don't understand what's going on overseas, et cetera. So I do worry about the rift between those two.
That's a great observation. And I contrast it with many other countries. So I'll use as an example, Finland or Israel, where it's expected that everybody has their job to, there's an amount of service you're expected to put forth. And it is a different perspective. I have a friend who's at one point was the CEO of one of their big telecom companies. And we were setting up some time with him. He said, "Oh, I can't meet that particular month." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because I'm on military duty." I was like, "What?" Mm-hmm. And by then he was in his 40s. I mean, a very powerful person, but no, everybody does it. So very, very interesting. So you emerge.
Well, there's an interesting anecdote on that, because I couldn't agree more. And I think and I would not have said this in the military, but the idea of a position on national service, I think, is important, and I wish it was in more of our national debates. And I don't think everyone has to necessarily serve in military uniform, but civilian corps in the U.S., Teach for America, programs like that, City Year, et cetera, should be expanded so that every young person in the United States has an opportunity to commit a year of service or more if they choose to something along those lines. And when I years ago spent time working with the Swedish special operations folks, and we were in their capital for a weekend, and we went to the changing of the guard at the castle. And it's a ceremonial sort of thing. Obviously, the king is usually in the castle, but there's every 24 hours there's a different group that guards the castle, and it's people in their conscript year. So every person, theoretically, in Sweden has spent at least 12 hours guarding the castle of the royal family. And that's just such a powerful connection point amongst the population. So everybody, no matter where they are, and it tends to be a fun night and they throw a big party afterwards, everyone in the country has some version of that story that they can share with you.
That's wonderful. I did not know that. That is a fascinating anecdote. So fast forward to here you are with McChrystal Group, a super talented group of people. I had the opportunity to interact with some of your colleagues, and it's been a great joy to do that. So a company comes to you. What do they typically say is the problem? Because in my experience working with companies, usually what they say is the problem, when you dig into it a little bit, is not actually the problem. So what do they say is the problem, and then how do you go about figuring out what the real issues are?
Yeah, first I would certainly agree with that. My understanding now, and we were the same way in the military, but my understanding of organizations is sort of like going to your primary care physician and saying, my knee is killing me, I need to get it operated on. And they say, well, let us do our job. And after some tests, they come back and say, well, it's actually your back that's out of whack, and that's making you walk differently. And so, if the first thing we did was operate on your knee, it wouldn't have gotten any better. And I think any big organization is the same way. You see these manifestations and say, well, the problem is our sales team isn't moving fast enough. Well, is it that, or is it decisions aren't coming through quick enough? Is there a disconnect with marketing? All these other levers that come into play. So usually when we have organizations that approach us, or those early stage conversations, it tends to be somewhere in the neighborhood of much like we found in the military. We're doing everything we've always done at the best we ever have. We're working harder than we ever have. We're sleeping less. We have the best products we've ever had, et cetera, et cetera. Like all these indicators are saying this is a great team working really hard, and better than arguably we ever have. But it's still not working like it should. If we'd have been pushing this hard 20 years ago, we'd be blowing by everyone. Now we're pushing even harder, and the numbers keep getting worse and worse and worse. We're burning our people out. There's all these little competitors popping up that we can't keep up with. And we're sort of out of levers to pull. We can't figure out what to do next. And that frustration cascades down. that tends to be where the conversation started, because, and I think the synergy with a group like ours is that's where we started, right? We were equally hardworking, talented group, but just frustrated because we couldn't figure out why it wasn't working like it should have been. And so that tends to be the opening salvo of conversation. And then from there, our work goes deeper on trying to assess the problem and implementing the teaming model we believe in.
Mm-hmm. So how do you handle it when you get a leader who's kind of just giving this lip service? You know, like, yes, I want to change the culture. Don't you think you need to change? You know, that kind of thing. Because there must be some ways of getting them engaged. I mean, I run into this all the time in my work on innovation, which is people say, yeah, we want innovation. I spent an entire year working with an organization where my direct connection was all about it. He was like, yes, we got to do this and da, da, da. And then what I found out after the year was that the guy who was the main shareholder wanted to cash out at the end of that year. And he had told the CEO that that's what he wanted. And so all this stuff that you're going to be spending on innovation is off the table. And I was like, if you could have just told me that at the beginning of the year, I would have given you different advice and we would have done something really different. I wouldn't have been banging away on this innovation thing.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think one of the, it's the old saying, don't let a good crisis pass. So this last few months obviously has been incredibly hard on a lot of people, a real pressure test for our economy writ large. But on a 10-year horizon, we will learn amazing things out of this. And so right now, I think when I hear leaders talking about changing and adapting, it's the most genuine it's ever been, right? But
Okay.
that's people's feet are to the fire. So that's not super surprising.
They can't avoid it anymore.
That's right. Perhaps you could have gotten out of it.
Some wit once said, you can count on Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all other alternatives.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly. I think I want to say it was Churchill. I'm not sure that. But going back before this crisis hit, certainly for in one of the first things we'll say and look for if we're going to do work with an organization is, okay, who is the leader that owns this? Mm-hmm. And it could be we work from startup small teams all the way to Fortune 10 companies, right? And so maybe that's a business unit head, maybe it's a region leader, maybe it's a sales team leader, maybe it's the CEO. But I need to know who is that person. And I want to sit down with her and say, okay, here's the deal. If you are not 100% on board with this, then don't start. Right? You're going to waste your time and money, and it's just going to set promises for your people that you're not wanting to live into, because this involves you. You have to be at the center of these conversations. And we're talking about shifting a mindset and culture. No one's going to suddenly step in and say, now that I have the platform built out, I'm going to step in and say, well, what we're missing in this market is X, and the competition is doing it better. I mean, that's wishful thinking or out of a movie. They need to hear it from you. You have to tease that out, and you have to give example after example, making that okay. And then people will start creating this trust-based sort of honest dialogue culture. And so if you're not going to put in the reps or the hours, don't start going down this path. And we've gotten pretty good at looking out for that, right? And so if we find that that's the situation, we'll say, look, it's just not worth working together right now because your heart's not in it. Mm-hmm. But when you find that in a leader and a leadership team, it's magic. Then you can just move incredibly fast because they're the ones you're doing the finishing touches on a culture that's under the surface, just waiting to come out.
Okay, so sort of it's got a lot of the right building blocks, but it needs to be sort of taken to the next level, I guess.
Yeah, and I think there has been, my experience has shown me, if you think of the three big levels of an organization between the executives, the management, and whoever your frontline folks are, when we start a dialogue with a company, and if we're going to do work, there's sort of three different reactions. The executives, they know now if we have a discussion, they have to be part of the process. And so if you start doing work, they're obviously excited that this is how we want to run the company. We're on board. So they start really up here, and then they go through a little bit of a trough when they realize, oh gosh, I'm going to be like personally accountable and in these communication structures on a very regular cadence. And I'm going to have to say things that I don't like saying, or I'm going to hear things that I wish I'd heard in a sidebar meeting and react to them. And then they see how effective it is and they come back out. Frontline leaders tend to think this is awesome because we've been telling our senior leadership we should be more empowered, and this is going to make it happen. And they go through a little trough when they realize, oh, this is high accountability empowerment, because I am going to now be held accountable for the decision rights that I own, but I'm deciding not to take action on because I'm not quite comfortable yet. I really want Rita's permission. And people are going to see when I'm slow rolling things because I'm not quite comfortable yet. So they go through a little trough and then they come out of it. And it's the mid-management folks that this is the most threatening to, because they're the ones that traditionally sit at they're the interlocutors between strategy and execution. And so they kind of think out of the gates, like, I don't like this because what's my job in that world? But they quickly realize, and the same thing happened to us in the military, your life, I mean, that's never, for most people, it's not the funnest part of your career. But as we really start to open up and create networks inside the organization, you are sitting in the most powerful seat because you're connected with the CEO and the C-suite. You're close enough to the front line to be able to articulate those problems. And now you're going to have the structure and the authorities wherein you can create these cross-boundary networks really quickly. You can see, Chris can come in and say, oh, we lost the Owings deal. And they'll say, Rita, go help Chris because you know the Owings folks. I think you can fix this. And then boom, in a matter of minutes, that mid-level person is really back in the action. And as that's taking place, they're going up to the C-suite going, hey, the Owings deal was falling off the rails, but we think we've got it fixed and we'll circle back in an hour. Like, their lives become so much more interesting and connected to the organization.
And do you think that's going to be one of the ways we work our way through this whole COVID slowdown? I mean, I've never in my life experienced an economic crisis, a healthcare crisis, and a justice crisis all at the same time. I mean, this is just unprecedented levels of uncertainty. So one of the things, and that question came in about, optionality and how do we, take out options and how do we avoid having to be too deterministic about what the ROI on this is, whatever. And I just think we're, as you alluded to earlier, we're in a period where the premium on learning is just unbelievable. And it seems to me that your methodology is very suitable for that. That it's a great way to, get that information into as many human brains as possible.
Yeah, I like the saying that in today's environment, your structure is your strategy, right? It's how you connect as an organization and becoming, we can all say learning organization. We can all say adaptability. We can all say, whatever, anti-fragile, all the things that are out there. But do you have the structures in place to actually make that a thing? What is, when people say we're a learning organization, I don't want to know what you mean by that. I got a sense of it. I want to know how you do it. To walk me through the processes that make you a learning organization. And if I don't hear something that's significantly different than a traditional business structure, say, okay, well, like you have good knowledge management, you have a great SharePoint site, et cetera. Does that really make you a learning organization?
Right.
Or are you just creating things where your top 10% can get even better? Because they're the ones that are going to leverage your KM tools, et cetera. A learning organization was what I grew up in, where every single day you were dialed in and learning from one another across boundaries. And you would watch your, much better sister unit or peer level commander who was executing at a higher level, talk through honestly what they were learning, what they were doing, how they've made mistakes, what was working. And you could immediately grab that knowledge and make your unit better. And that unit commander was doing that not just to tell the leadership what was going on, they were doing it to make everybody a little bit more capable every single day. So that's where I really believe on the issue you're addressing. The way you structure yourself is critical to how successful you'll be. The best strategy doesn't matter if you're not communicating with your people, if you're not learning from the edge, if you're not empowering them beyond sort of ink on paper commentary.
Can you speak a little bit about trust across diversity? And by diversity, I don't mean like political correctness, but I mean people, and I think the military is brilliant at this. You take people from all walks of life and somehow you have to get them to trust and depend on one another. And in the civilian world, I think it's a little less part of what people are recognizing as a responsibility. Let's put it that way. So how do you create, when you've got people who really are, not inclined to trust one another in the early stages, how do you forge that?
Yeah, a little bit on the military, and then the broader. I mean, obviously, one of the, again, on a 10-year horizon, I think we all hope that we're going to find this to be a very powerful window of learning and improvement as a society. The units I grew up inside the military, and again, it goes back to this disconnect between understanding of those two environments. And a lot of this is through popular media, I think the way the military is depicted, et cetera. Most operational units just don't care about who you are, your background. I don't care if you're tall or short, a man or woman, et cetera. Are you good at your job? When you show up, do we win more often, right? And if the answer is yes, then I don't care what uniform you're in. I don't care what your background is. I don't care if you went to the Naval Academy or a community college, right? We win when you're on the team, period. But that's in units that are under high stress and can test that on a very regular basis, right? It's very measurable. Right. So you really do start to create a team based on a meritocracy, right? What we found, though, was doing that at scale, opening up to more transparent communication models. You were able to, because, I'm not putting our organization on a pedestal. There were certainly different personalities and more traditional ones. And in a traditional organization, if I report to you, I can have 20 people underneath me that I just beat up all the time, and I can look brilliant to you because I steal all their work and show it to you. When we started communicating with speed and transparency, and you had to keep up with the pace of change, you would ask me in real time, as an example, okay, well, what do we think's going on with this problem? And I would give a bad answer, and you would say, okay, get out of the way. Who's the analyst on your team that wrote that report? And I go, oh, well, it's Private Smith. And a young woman would step on camera and say, well, let me tell you exactly what we think's going on. And now she is highlighted to 6,000 people around the world as the brilliant person that I'd been hiding from everyone, right? And I had 3 opportunities in my career to submit what's called a by name request. When you're putting a staff together to go fight a specific problem, all 3 BNRs that I submitted, which is not unique or special, it just happens on occasion, were all for women in the force that I would have never known existed had we not communicated with that level of transparency. Because I was being tasked to go forward in a very male-dominated organization, tasked with specific problems in corners of the world that I knew. I've never met this woman, but I've heard her talk countless times about this specific problem. I'm requesting that she become part of my staff. And she accepts the orders, and boom, now she's forward deployed into this small team. And I want her there because I know she knows this problem better than anybody. And I would have never seen that in a more traditional siloed organization. Yeah. So I think it plays out in a really important way. And I hope one of the knock-on effects of the speed with which people are having to communicate organizationally now, I hope they don't lose that insight of, wow, I'm really hearing from voices that honestly, somebody didn't even know they were in the organization 4 months ago. Right. And so don't lose that as you transition back into whatever the next normal is going to look like.
That's inspiring. That's great. So we're nearly out of time. I can't believe that just flew. So how do our listeners hear more? How do they learn more about you and your work and some of the philosophies that we've been talking about?
Yeah, all of our work we're trying to really push out there is on our website, McChrystalGroup.com, or they can Google me or Stan McChrystal, et cetera. It'll take you to our website. And we put up a bunch of playbooks and are thinking about cross-siloed communication. Anything we think can be helpful in these times, it's all just hung up there for people to download. And then obviously our books and whatnot if people have more free time, but I don't think that's the norm these days.
I'll do another product placement show.
There you go.
That's the book. Well, Chris, it has been an absolute pleasure and a delight to share an hour with you. And I so appreciate your taking the time. I think a lot of responses from our listeners have been that this was just exactly the conversation that they wanted to hear. So thank you ever so much.